This week we're looking at social structures and how they relate to communication. Social structures, if you recall, are the layer of culture that takes values and interprets them and codifies them and then prescribes the behavior of the people based on those values. It also takes new behavior and new innovation and brings that back down into and decides how it fits within the systems and how it fits within the values. So social structures are very important for determining how we communicate and how we behave. We'll also explore two elements, the first being societal structures that differ around the world, divided as band, tribal, peasant, and urban. And then secondly, we'll look at 5 social institutions, which are association, kinship, education, economics, and law. So social structures highly dictate communication patterns. Each type of social structure has different communication needs. And so each social institution creates unique situational patterns. Situational patterns form immediate context, and communication is linked to that context. So when you think about it, look at this image. How do you even begin to make sense of what is happening here? There's so much that we wouldn't understand about this because it's set in a very specific context, a very specific time. There are activities taking place, there are clothing, there are things happening that just don't make sense from this picture to us because of the societal structure and the societal norms, and even the societal institutions of family or economics that might be apparent here. Okay, so Adam and Eve would be maybe typical of what we would look at in a band society today, living off the land, eating of every tree of the garden. That livelihood is the description of a band society. So band societies today live on the fringe of mainstream society or outside of global societies. They're not even aware of global societies, and we're not aware of them. There's fewer and fewer of them because they're starting to enter relationships with the outside world, but they're actually still perceived as outside of the economic and cultural flow. In most countries, governments have sought to stabilize and assimilate these band societies. That's especially true where the land they live in has become seen as a valuable asset. And so today they're in a state of transformation, really against their will. They tend to prize their independence, and so that can lead to some negative contact and resistance to outside influence. So the social order of band society is shaped by their small size, their dependence on game, fruit, seeds, and other wild food. And they have a very simple structured life, simple technology, but they're highly relational. They don't have professional positions. Nobody gets paid to lead or paid to practice medicine or law or anything. Everything they own is owned publicly. There's no sense of private ownership, no sense of private information as a result. They depend on group decision making. They are egalitarian, so they don't have a high level of hierarchy or structure in their society, but they're also fairly individualistic as opposed to the tribal that we'll look at next. Because most people within it, they can come and go as they please, especially as hunting and gathering take place. If food scarcity grows, then the groups will disband and smaller groups will go off one way and smaller groups another. And so there's a bit of a voluntary association, but they are strong families. So families will stay together, but within a larger group, more of a voluntary association that may disband at any time. The family groups have some degree of social control. The voluntary associations have less control, but they are a face-to-face society, and they maintain communication that is verbal and high context. They have very little written language. Their history is stored in a rich oral tradition, and it's supplemented by rituals and stories and maybe song and dance. They have a high level of cultural knowledge. They're aware of their surroundings and interaction with their surroundings. They focus their religion on immediate need, or they don't really think about ultimate questions. And they may be aware of the spirit realm, especially where they practice ritual and magic, trying to influence spiritual power. So communication with or to these people is a very different type of communication because we're trying to reach high context people with an oral tradition, and they're not going to respond to some of the things that we would normally say. Do you want to go to heaven? Their concept of heaven may be very, very different than ours, and they may not even have a concept of heaven. To illustrate a tribal society, let's look at Abraham as he departs from Ur. In Genesis 12, it says, Abraham took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered and the people that they acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to the land of Canaan. Abraham passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring, I will give this land. This is a tribal clan. Abraham, or Abram at this time, is a sojourner. He's a town dweller, but he becomes a nomadic herdsman. He leaves his clan and he strikes out to do life as a smaller clan with just his family and his brother's son. So in a sense, he becomes a tribe. This whole new societal structure is around the fact that he has no land. He's a nomad. He probably took Lot because it was expedient to have another adult male from the clan. His reason for moving apart from society is a call from God. There's no immediate sense of integration into the new culture that's around him. In fact, in Genesis 23, after Sarah dies, Abraham calls himself an outsider. He says, I'm a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property that I may bury my dead. So tribal societies are marked by greater sophistication, tools in farming, more complex social systems than the band society would have, a larger size, more permanent settlements, not moving frequently from place to place, except in the case of nomadic tribes. And then kinship is central. Very successful human organizations, very stable, enduring communities emerging, and eventually being absorbed into present and urban societies. So today, where you find tribal groups, the tribe lives together maybe in a village, they hold land communally, they hold all things communally, so even game animals belong to everybody. Political boundaries are somewhat foreign to them. You actually have this story of Abraham and Lot, where they create a political boundary to overcome a problem that they're facing, but prior to that time, they didn't hold those political boundaries. And they're domesticating plants and animals. They have little trade with others. There's some simple market gatherings, probably local, but it's increasing. And then if they're pastoral tribes, they probably are still nomadic, following available grasslands. Politically, power is in the hands of the family and group, and there's a group discipline within the family, and shame is very strong, honor is very strong. They may shame somebody or send somebody away if they fail or sin. They do make alliances with other tribes, but those may be fairly temporary. They may actually go to war with other tribes very quickly. There's a group decision making, and leadership is by consensus, not by hierarchical leadership. They're storytellers. They have a strong oral tradition. They are going to be illiterate, but they're going to be high context, and they're going to have a strong cultural memory. And that would include myths and rituals and other things that might communicate their values. So Abraham starts off kind of like a band society, taking his little clan with him, leaving Haran. By the time he settles into the promised land, he is now becoming a nomadic tribal society. They're actually settling down, finding permanent dwellings, more of a tribal presence. But when Abraham's grandson, Israel, follows his son Joseph into Egypt, and they settle into Egypt, they move from being a tribal society and become part of a peasant society. And the factors that determine that are really that in Egypt, they are no longer in control of the land. The land isn't perceived as belonging to the people. The land is perceived as belonging to the nation, to the government, in fact. And so the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, he controls this land, and he determines where this group can live. He gives them a place to live within the land. They form villages and they farm and they raise livestock and they produce material goods. They're part of the society that way, but they are separate from the rest of society. They're a small group within a larger group. So we would call that a heterogeneous collection of homogeneous people. They have their own language, they have their own culture, but they're part of the Egyptian culture as well. Within peasant societies, people do maintain that cultural and group distinctions, and therefore there may be multiple castes also within a society, and then economically multiple economic castes even within a village. And so there's an increasing complexity that didn't exist in the tribal band or the band society, the tribal group. So caste usually represents economic distinctions along with ethnic ones. There's going to be different hierarchy, fairly rigid social order. There may be a class system with hierarchy based on wealth, power, and prestige. And people can gain status through education, but they're still considered commoner. The economics of a peasant society are that the people are generally subsistent farmers with market controlled by the elite. In the towns, sellers may be seen on the low end, but in the village, they're actually on the high end of society. There's ostentatious wealth within the towns, but in the villages, it's still discouraged. The family has its own economy. Their goal is to stay alive. They work to eat, not to grow wealthy. And therefore, for them, relationship prevails over productivity, but the society as a whole may hold them to productivity. So specialization does emerge, but they remain very relational within the smaller groups of the peasant groups within the larger society. It's also a thing that emerges, kind of a patron-client relationship, where wealthy people who own the land are the patrons who govern the people. The peasants are the clients who are responsible to respond to the patron in whatever way is expected. And there is a bit of a relationship there where the patron has an obligation to be protective towards his clients, towards his people, and the people therefore have a responsibility to be responsive or faithful towards their patron. The people see themselves as people of the land, but the land does not belong to them. The land belongs to the rulers and the state. Within the peasant groups, there will be high context where everyone knows everything, but they also have to manage a lower context society as a whole that they're a part of. They have their smaller groups that communicate one way, but then they're part of a system that communicates in another way. It also may create a situation where the peasant people actually begin to distrust the elite or distrust outsiders and to not take as much risk as maybe tribal people or band people would have. There also is a little bit of a sense of the concept of limited good within the peasant society. There's only so much in the world the rulers, the elite have it, we don't have it. That's because they've taken it from us. If only we could get some of that back, we would be happy, but we're not happy because we don't have much and they have a lot. Rather than seeing themselves as capable of creating wealth for themselves, they just see their lot in life as where they belong and what they're a part of. I just put this here to mention that when Israel flees Egypt to go to the promised land, that transition of being in the wilderness is a really more of a return to a tribal society. They organize themselves according to clans, they live according to clans, they govern themselves according to clans. And so it's more of a tribal structure that emerges there. But as they settle into the land, the book of Judges and Samuel describe a shift of Israel moving from nomadic tribal to agrarian peasant and then to an urban society. And so the factors of urban society with complex systems with a symbiotic relationship with peasantry. So peasantry may still exist, but then emerging in the city is the urban society. And so there's this relationship between the two. The multiple levels of the complex structure of a nation, and then down to city, and then down to local communities and families, different levels of society. The relationships are based, therefore, on power, prestige, economy, and status, not on kinship. So who you're related to is very important based on how it benefits you economically. That creates within the urban society greater specialization. We said in the peasant society, specialization emerges, like trades like blacksmith and carpenter, but in the urban society it gets even more specific. But the urban societies tend to be diverse. They may separate within the community as different class or ethnic neighborhoods. There may be a lot of hierarchy and bureaucracy to the government. And actually, bureaucracy really begins to emerge in the urban society where it didn't exist hardly at all in the tribal society. For urban dwellers, change is the dominant feature. Change is considered good, and it's nothing to be feared, just it's normal. They have a society where they have to maintain multiple relationships with each being clearly defined. So you have your groups that you're a part of that relate to your work, and groups that relate to your community, and groups that relate to your religion, and groups that relate to your family. And you keep all those separate in your mind, and you maintain your relationships with them differently. You might still have a strong sense of family, but it's going to be a reduced sense of family, more of a nuclear family rather than a large clan mentality. And then a growing sense of networks and relationship through networks. We'll talk about that in just a minute, and associations as well. So urban societies are less personal, but they are more structured. They have multiple ethnic groups within, and those ethnic groups may or may not integrate and create either subcultures or come into the mainstream of culture. There are classes and class distinctions, and there will still be ostentatious wealth, but also extreme poverty. But somehow the urban society likes to hide that poverty from view. So that's the four general types of social structures. It's pretty broad, and you can look at it and think about how do all of these things work, and what would be the implications if I were called by God to go work among a tribal group. For instance, I have a friend in Tanzania, and he felt the call of God to work among a nomadic tribal group. And it was a very difficult decision for him because he was married. He couldn't build a house for his family. He had to follow these people wherever they went, and they sometimes randomly moved. So he ended up not living with them full time, but sometimes he would go back to visit them, to minister within the community, and they would have moved, and he had to go find them again. And so the lifestyle was very difficult for him moving from an urban society into that, and it was something that he just couldn't do permanently. He had to take it in pieces. He could not move his family into that society. It was too big of a jump for him. But he also had to learn to communicate the way they communicate and to think the way they think. And there was just huge differences between that nomadic tribe and the urban society that he'd come from. Okay, let's take a quick look at these 5 social institutions. And why is it important? Well, sometimes getting it wrong has been fatal. We look at association and its impact on communication. Impact association being the first one we're going to look at. We have to understand under what rules those structures function. And history is full of people like Ferdinand Magellan who didn't. Magellan landed in the Philippines in 1521, and he was welcomed by a certain tribal chieftain named Humabon, who claimed to be a king of sorts. Now, Magellan interpreted the concept of king through the European worldview and through European social structure of the urban society. Humabon was just a local tribal chief, but he had enemies, and he asked Magellan to help him fight those enemies. And Magellan thought that if he helped Humabon fight his enemies, he would gain the favor of this king of this great island nation, not understanding that Humabon was not the king of this great island nation. And that was the end of Magellan's voyage around the world. He died at what is called the Battle of Mactan at the hands of Lapu-Lapu, another chief who now serves as a strong Filipino hero for his fight to repel colonial imperialism. But both Humabon and Lapu-Lapu were just tribal chieftains, not kings. There was nothing to be gained from helping Humabon fight Lapu-Lapu. it would have not have secured the entire archipelago's allegiance with Spain as Magellan had hoped. So understanding social institutions and how they function is important. And so let's first look at the social institution of association, the way we align ourselves with others in society. And to illustrate, I'll tell a brief story. So once upon a time, this is a true story, a young newlywed couple named Walter and Lucille Morrison were at a beach and they were throwing a 5-cent pie tin back and forth between them. And as they left the beach, someone on the beach offered them 25 cents for the 10 because they thought that the game they were playing looked like fun. So Walter and Lucille thought, well, somebody would pay 5 times the value of that object. But then Walter was shortly enlisted as a pilot in World War II. But post-war, they came back to the idea and he created what he called the Whirlaway, which he later sold to a company named Wham-O, who named it the Pluto Platter. But then after a group of college students began calling it Frisbee after a famous pie company, again, the pie tin, that was Frisbee Pies, they renamed the disc into Frisbee, and the rest is history. Now we've been playing Frisbee all over the world. How does that relate to our topic here? Well, when a group of friends picks up a Frisbee, they're voluntarily associating with one another. There are little or no defined rules or structure. There's no leader, but they do have a single purpose. They want to have fun. And so in a way, they're a little bit like a band society. They're an informal voluntary association. But if you add a few more people to the mix, a need for greater formality exists. Who throws to who and how? And so Frisbee changed over time and became a more formal institution that took several directions. The most commonly known are Ultimate Frisbee and Frisbee Golf or Disc Golf. Disc Golf has more structure than the previous informal group. There are rules and a prescribed course to follow, and it gives another use to ski areas in the US during the summer. But in spite of the rules and the course, if you're just playing with family or friends, you're not likely to care a lot about anything else than throwing the Frisbee into the basket and having fun. You're still a small voluntary association, more like a band, more purposeful than the prior band of Frisbee throwers, but still more of a band. But Frisbee Golf doesn't stop there. There are organizations, associations, clubs, teams, and these act more in the way tribes do, with new structures, some sort of emerging leadership, a stronger commitment to the group, identity found within the group. These tribes take this game seriously. And they're specially designed discs for different situations on the course and other equipment of varying levels of seriousness, beginner packs, pro packs, bags, and other equipment. In addition to local organizations and clubs, there's an international professional association that has a commissioner. Now, this is a very formal association. Within it, there are elements that are less of a voluntary association. You might want to join a group within the PDGA, but not have the experience or player ranking to be allowed in. You have to earn your way in. You can't just join. It also begins to reflect some of the complexity and diversity of the urban society. It has specialization, associations delineated by age, gender, and ranking, as well as regional and national divisions. Players have ratings, sort of a caste system, if you will. They participate in tours, tournaments, and championships. They even have a culture museum named after the father of disc golf, a man by the name of Steady Ed Hedrick. The equipment used by members of the association is highly specialized and must be approved. And there are rules, a 44-page rule book to be exact, and that doesn't include the 17-page manual for competition events. These rules show some of the features that a formal association and urban structure would have. There's a hierarchy of officials, there's centralized control, and there are rules and there are resolution mechanics for violation of those rules. So you can see that each type of social structure has different types of association, and within each society's different associations are different ways it's governed and different rules. And that's just the first of the 5 we're going to look at, association. Now let's look at kinship. Who relates to who and how? This image shows a biological genealogy, and that's how we tend to think of kinship. Communication patterns within kinship are based on relationships. So when you think about how you relate to the different people in your family, you actually communicate differently. You talk differently to your parents than you would to your grandparents, perhaps. You obviously talk differently to your grandparents than you would to your cousins. And so your communication patterns are distinct and based along kinship lines. And then, of course, when you marry, that changes your communication patterns, changes the relationship of the structure. And this kinship structure now widens or changes to include the new family that you're marrying into. And that comes with its whole different set of communication patterns. And anybody who's gotten married understands that when you marry, you enter into a new family that talks differently, that acts differently, that has different traditions, different behavior. When you marry outside of your culture, you'll obviously then encounter different kinship obligations. The role of wife or husband may differ greatly, and the expectations of your other culture spouse or your other culture in-laws can be confusing. But there are other ways of relating as kin, and it doesn't take into account in this chart any ceremonial kinship. Can you think of any sort of ceremonial kinship that might exist in your culture? where somebody is considered as a kin, but isn't really. Probably the ceremonial role of godparent comes to mind. And when we say godfather, we might think of the Godfather movie. But it probably looks more like this. We still use godparent as a ceremonial kinship. It's far more important in some countries than others. It comes with certain obligations and relationships. Because of my sojourn in the Philippines, where you can become a godparent through either sponsoring a child at baptism or a couple in their wedding, I have several godchildren. These are two of my godchild couples, Merle and Danny, and Dirk and Sharon. And some of you may have met them if you've been with Bethany in the past. I was a sponsor for both of their weddings. And that's an important role that made me their godparent, or in the Ilocano, their ninong. As a result, you'll probably never hear Merle or Sharon, as Filipinas, call me by my name, Paul. They'll always call me Ninong. And they may actually greet me by taking my hand and drawing it to their forehead and blessing something like this. You won't see Dirk or Danny do this because they're Americans and it feels uncomfortable and awkward. Technically, they should, but you won't see it happen. But through a number of instances, including these two weddings, I came into a relationship with others who are also sponsors of the same events. So when two people become godparents of the same couple, they, along with the couple's actual parents, all enter into the relationship of co-parent. And so I have several co-parents for which the Ilocano borrow the Spanish terms compadre or pare for short, and comadre or mare for short. These people, who some of you may also know, are also godparents to Danny and Merle and Dirk and Sharon. So technically, I should always call Carol and Val mare and Tim and Steve pare. And you actually sometimes hear us do that. It's a sign that we use to acknowledge our relationship through our ceremonial children. In the Philippines, it's very important, and it would be wrong for me to address my pare or mare by their first name. That would be actually a lack of respect. By calling them pare or mare instead of by name, I show that I understand the importance of the relationship we have with each other. So kinship as a social institution does deeply influence communication patterns, languages, and so forth. Who talks to who? Who should talk to who? How do you greet an elder? What authority does a grandmother have? All of those are part of the kinship structures. For your assignment this week, I'm going to ask you to watch this movie. It covers a whole range of communication issues, but kinship is at the center theme of this movie, and I think it's very interesting. We'll go more quickly through the remaining social institution of education, economics, and law. Education as a social institution will vary based on social structure. What works in America might not work elsewhere. This is a school much like the one my daughters attended in the Philippines as children. The way education is conducted from country to country can vary greatly. And this is a missionary training school in Nigeria for evangelical missionaries. African students coming to America are sometimes scandalized by how poorly American students dress, act, and treat their instructors. But if you were asked to teach English or something else in another country, the method, manner, structure, expectations of the educational system may be very different from what you've known. If you attend a language school in another country, you may have to dress up, and you may have to treat the instructor with greater respect and deference than you've been accustomed to treating your instructor back home. Beyond that, the educational system of a more tribal society may not have schooling at all, but rather skills and knowledge are passed down from generation to generation in more of an oral and practical tradition. You think about the early church, had no seminaries, and many, if not most members of the early church were illiterate, but they did have theological education and they did know God. The educational structures of illiterate societies are built more on memory, with story being strong. It's actually one of the contrasts between Jesus's teaching and Paul's. Jesus taught in ways that people could remember. He probably taught the same things over and over, reciting the Sermon on the Mount in such a way that his disciples actually had it memorized. Whereas Paul was a learned, literate man, and he could use letters to convey thought. And because these would be read, he didn't depend on stories and parables, but was able to use more abstract constructions. When we think of economics, we might think of Wall Street, banks, the Federal Reserve, money, and such. But it also has to do with any system by which goods and services are distributed. In the Philippines, we had more of a sense of collective property within the peasant rural villages. So in the language, I would never say in the Philippines, my house. I would always say our house, because houses don't belong to people, they belong to families. There's also the idea sometimes in the peasant society, as I said, of limited good, the idea that there's only so much in the world, and if you have a lot and I have a little, you must have some of mine. Therefore, expecting you to share with me is actually quite normal. And then there's the concept of reciprocity. A lot of societies in their economic structure have a reciprocity concept of, if I do something for you, you should do something for me, which is why people in reciprocal societies, generally, if they go out to a meal together, say in a restaurant, they won't split the tab ever. One person will pay the bill, and then everybody else in the group kind of keeps a mental note. Next time it's going to be my turn, or yeah, it's been a while since I paid, I better pay soon, because everybody should reciprocate. Then turning to law, Law dictates who's in charge, what does leadership look like, what does a leader look like, what are the rules of the society, what happens if you break those rules, who enforces those rules, what does the law serve, to promote a moral standard or to promote a communal standard, or both. So laws exist for different reasons in different societies. At the time of Jesus, the social structure was a peasant structure with multiple castes and other distinctions. And this chart from Paul Hebert just gives you a few levels of that. And you can see the chief priests and Sadducees at the top, and then the Samaritans at the bottom, and then you have slaves and illegitimates and Israelites with grave blemish, couldn't produce their lineage. Israelites with slight blemish had some question in their lineage. Full Israelites who could produce a full lineage, and then Pharisees and Levites and other priests, and then at the very top, chief priests and Sadducees. Those are the caste distinctions or class distinctions that existed within Israel at the time of Jesus. A little simplification of that diagram, but the communication policy, the religious hierarchy of Jesus's time, was that communication lines between social structures were intact, and there was very little communication between. So peasants talked to peasants, full Israelites talked to full Israelites, Samaritans talked to Samaritans. So full Israelites didn't talk to Samaritans, and definitely Levites and Pharisees would not talk to a Samaritan or somebody at the lowest end. So the communication wasn't up and down. And so when the teaching of the law occurred within the society, the teaching of the law occurred among people of the same group. The masses didn't get a whole lot of the teaching of the law. The teaching of the law belonged to the smaller groups at the top of the hierarchy. Full Israelites could learn scripture, but mostly if they were Levites, Sadducees, or Pharisees or teachers. Jesus chose instead to recognize that hierarchy, but he took his message to the masses, including full Israelites, but also including those with blemish, slaves, and even Samaritans. And he spoke like a traditional storyteller, not like a theologian. His disciples even wondered why he chose that method. And he chose the informal colloquial language of Galilee, Aramaic, instead of Hebrew, which would have been the theological language of the elite. So each of these social institutions drive action at the behavioral level, and therefore each shape communication patterns within the society. They determine for us who we're allowed to talk to. How do we talk to different people? How do you teach? How do you learn? How do you buy a loaf of bread? How do you relate to the seller? How do you relate to your family members? How do you relate to people outside of your family, and so on? All of these institutions and structures govern the way we interact with people and govern our communication.